I'm Peter van der Putten, and I'm a director for AI solutions at American software company called Pega Systems. And next to that, I'm also an assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands in the area of AI. And basically, I look at the impact of AI in business, research, arts, and science.
Great. So the first question then is technology, and actually we could ask this question twice. We can say is technology, and then we can say is AI. So we've got sort of two questions here, but it's the same sort of thing. Is technology good or bad?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me use a quote from Melvin Kranzberg, the law of technology, or one of his laws. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I think the same applies to AI technology. And that's a statement that you can interpret in different ways, right? But I think it alludes to that AI in general, a technology in general, it's hard to say whether it's good or bad, because the same technology can be used for good purposes and bad purposes, and it's especially the case in AI, which is a fairly generic technology where we can learn to become intelligent, to solve problems in a smart way by learning from feedback and from data. So the same AI techniques can be used to, find a cure for cancer, or to do something evil, to implement mass surveillance. Yeah. So basically, it's you could explain it as maybe not at the general technology. It's hard to say whether it's good or bad. But it's never neutral, because the moment you build a particular AI application for a particular purpose, then it's never neutral. There's always choices that you make for starters, for what is the purpose? Is it for mass surveillance, or are we curing cancer? But it's also more nuanced, like how do I approach this problem? What kind of data do I select to train these systems? What kind of logic do I embed in automated decisions? Etc. Right? So I would agree with that statement. Is neither good or bad at the generic technology level. The moment you start to build applications, it will never be value free, and it's good to be aware of that.
That's great. So I think this is quite a good quote. Gary Kasparov has said that technology is the reason why people are alive to complain about technology.
That's a nice one. Yeah.
Okay, so should we be afraid of AI?
I think, when I talk about AI, typically I introduce it a little bit with asking the question, what does, if you just walk out your door and you ask a random person in the street, what is AI, what will be the first association? And it's probably something like robots that take over the world. Yeah. And we have to succumb to their wishes. It's not strange, of course. That's a meme that has been popularized by Hollywood movies. And it plays with our fear to no longer be the center of the universe, our fear of losing control. But AI is not just about the F of fear. For me, it's also about the F of fascination, because if we were just afraid of it, it would have disappeared as a meme. But we are really fascinated by AI because we're fascinated by ourselves, essentially. What is intelligence? Where is it coming from? How can it evolve? Those are questions that not just AI researchers have been asking for 50 years, but philosophers have been asking these questions for 2,000 years, or even down back to the Neanderthals. These were probably thoughts that were crossing our minds when we were sitting at the campfire. So there's equal portions of fear and fascination around AI. Should we be afraid of it? I don't think so. I don't think we can always predict, the consequences of building certain AI applications. And for sure, bad things can happen. Yeah, so we need to be aware of it. Like I said, it's not a value-free technology, but I also believe in agency, right? So I believe that we're an adaptive species, and we need to have the awareness that, for example, that biases can evolve, and that we need to correct them. But it is correctable. So I always believe in not being afraid, because in a way that would be sticking our heads in the sand for both good and bad aspects of AI. Likewise, a techno-utopian view of it it's also a way of sticking your heads in the sand, because that's ignoring the problems that can arise. But we should take an active role and learn to live alongside AI, and make the best use of it.
Okay. So you don't envisage an occasion when a robot looking like a naked Arnold Schwarzenegger will come from the future to try and change our fate then?
Well, we shouldn't be waiting for singularity to happen, because the future is already here. Like in a way, AI is being used in certain pockets of society at a grand scale, right? So, for instance, at my company, we're doing a lot of automated decisioning, and our platforms were doing something in the order of in excess of 1 billion real-time decisions per day. I don't know, sometimes. So it is something that's affecting our lives already today, right? In good ways and in bad ways. So I'd rather not wait for Arnold Schwarzenegger to come in some distant future. I'd rather look at both the risks and rewards around AI today. Yeah.
So you're talking about a fascination with intelligence, but it often seems to me that whatever the technology we have at any one time, we draw a metaphor between that technology and intelligence.
Yep.
So there was a time when we tried to explain intelligence in terms of clockwork, and then later on in terms of steam engines, and now then computers, and now it's AI. So is AI different? I mean, does that take us any closer to an understanding of intelligence than we had in the past?
I think that's a great question. And of course, always funny to look back to these older periods and the metaphors that we're using back then. To what extent people get too much kind of, let's say, sucked into that metaphor and then making all kinds of crazy statements. Whereas, when our insights progress, we see also the limitations of these metaphors. Is AI different? I don't see AI necessarily that much as a metaphor in that sense. The metaphors are more, like you said, the automatons or the steam engines or the computer with its working memory, etc. I see AI more as kind of the general thirst for us to understand, what is intelligence, where is it coming from, and how is it making us human. In that sense, you could even generalize from artificial intelligence. I sometimes talk more in my research around artificial X. So X equals intelligence. Being a nerd, I need to use a formula, right? So, but X could also mean emotion or religion, or I think it's using these artificial metaphors. They have their limitations, but it's interesting. It's interesting to look at intelligence through an artificial lens and to see what more can we understand about intelligence by using that metaphor, but also we might get a better understanding of the limits of that particular metaphor. And the same goes for artificial creativity and artificial acts.
Okay, that's great. So the next question, my question is, can you think of 3 ways in which AI will benefit humanity?
Yet another good question. Of course, people sometimes also align it with things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals and things like that. And there's obviously quite a few areas where you could apply that. One, an obvious one, maybe in these days of COVID, is healthcare, right? So the use of this intelligence to do drug discovery, in silico experimentation of different types of drugs, but also more generically when we think about people with certain handicaps, how can we help the blind see again or the deaf hear again? There's no reason to stop then also to say we'll take the so-called normal people as the definition of how, what is good. So we could enable we could enable these people even further beyond the human standard. So we get a little bit into their superhumans. But I think healthcare in that sense, or in a broad sense, is an interesting field. Another one And of course, where we've seen a lot of progress recently in AI is around language and understanding of language. There's still a lot of work to do, but obviously language is the way how we express our culture, how we share, how we can have a quicker evolution than just natural selection, the cultural evolution. So if we can break down the barriers across different languages, it will enable potentially disadvantaged people to learn. You can imagine if you don't speak English, but if there's good language technology, and I could just have nowadays a relatively cheap smartphone, and I could still get the same access to, well, not the same, but maybe similar levels of action or better access to knowledge and education, and maybe it can also help people to understand each other better. And maybe the third area could be, and that same category is around topics like climate change, for example. So a side project that I did myself was together with Jeroen van der Most, who is an AI artist, and we used that language technology to give nature a voice. So to let the idea here is like you have melting glaciers, they're under threat of climate change, but they don't have a voice to warn us and protest about climate change. And we use that language technology, the latest one from OpenAI, to generate letters to world leaders, on behalf of the sinking island or the melting glacier. Now, that's of course a bit of a poetic project, but in general, you can imagine that climate change, when it's about simulation of climate or simulation of different instruments that we have to fight climate change, that AI could play a role there as well.
That's great. So, so your three examples there. The first one, I immediately thought of the $6 Million Man. Do you remember that TV series with the Bionic Man, Steve Majors? That was my first thought I had there. And your second one was about language translation. My first thought there was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the Babelfish, but it could bring down barriers. I think it could make the world a much more, it sounds idealistic, but it could make the world slightly more united and overcome cultural misunderstandings, I think, if AI can help us achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
Okay. And how has AI already had a positive impact on the world?
Yeah, so well, there's there's myriads of ways how AI has impacted the world, or maybe also our everyday lives. Take the likes of Google, whether you hate them or love them, we're all using it on a daily basis, most likely, to search for information, get connected to services and whatnot. So that's a very kind of basic example that comes with both its pluses and minuses, of course. I think another, it's maybe a little bit along the lines of those previous examples. And when I spoke about languages, why would it be kind of restricted to text and speech, right? So, for instance, one of the research projects I work on also has to do with sign language, right? So, how can we understand sign language? Can we automatically extract meaning from videos where people are signing? We're studying West African sign languages, so we're applying these methods in domains where we have movies of people signing in the wild, and also using systems that maybe originally were more trained on typical Western European people. And so here we're trying to make sure that we can apply these methods also in different domains. So I think that's also an example of potentially good applications of AI. And so I think overall the impact has been positive, but also I think we're, if you can use a metaphor, we're in the puberty of AI in society. In the beginning it was all fantastic, typical techno-optimism of all the wonderful things we could do with AI. And now, it's part of us growing up with AI entering our worlds. We're reaching this kind of AI puberty, and we start to see some of the behaviors of AI that we don't really like, which it's a natural evolution, right? So, and we need to learn to live with the AI and make sure that we are aware that indeed AI is not value free, and that we can prevent any unwanted side effects. And in this way, we will learn to live with the AI.
So how can AI become biased?
So there could be different ways how AI could become biased. Basically, you could say that it kind of ties back to what are some of the key ingredients of how AI really works, right? So take a computer chess program. Alan Turing, he wrote the first computer chess program. And what he did, he kind of took the rules of the game, because that would tell you how you could move a particular piece on the board. But you also need rules around what is likely to be a good move. And this way you can play against yourself, and you can think ahead, and you can prune this search space to make the right decisions. So that's rules and reasoning. And the other side of AI is more around machine learning, because how would you know? And Turing knew that as well himself. He said, "Well, I'm not the best chess player in the world, so who knows whether I came up with the right rules here? Maybe they're based on my assumptions and biases. And now, how can I ever become better?" So that's where machine learning actually came into play. So how can we learn from data? Can we learn from playing chess games and then ultimately become Deep Blue and beat Garry Kasparov? Or can we learn from playing a lot of simulated Go games and use that to become beat a human Go world champion like DeepMind did? And so both through reasoning and logic and rules, as well as through learning, that bias can creep in. And rules, because they're based on maybe certain assumptions that we make in these very explicit logic and rules that are essentially biased and wrong. Now, the good thing about learning is, to some extent, they can counter that, because machine learning can actually learn from data and from evidence, but it doesn't make it value free. And so if the way how I actually set up my data set, the way how I, what kind of data I feed to the system will actually influence whether, if I feed it biased information, the model is it's not good or bad, it's blind, and it will take whatever data you feed it and whatever correlations you feed it, and it will draw its conclusion based on the data. So that can influence it. A typical example was a healthcare model. There was a research paper in Science that reported on that. But it was a model built with good intent. Again, you can see that evil AI can come from also when people build something with good intent. Healthcare model for prevention. But the problem was that the people that built those models, they said like, oh, let's take the state of a patient, let's say at the end of 2018, and then let's see if they develop some disease in future. And what they did, they said like, let's predict what is the healthcare cost, let's say in 2019 or 2020. Well, you can already feel where it's going wrong here, because unfortunately, if you're in the US and you have the same health conditions, but you're black, less money will be spent on healthcare for you, right? So simply by using future healthcare costs or as a proxy, you're building bias into the system. And the researchers could correct that by saying, let's not look at the cost, but let's try to see whether we have data about whether people developed the chronic disease, yes or no, as opposed to how much did we spend on these particular patients. That would already make it better. I believe that 2.5 times more black people would be identified for a preventative care program this particular way. And so a little bit long-winded, but there are two key ingredients of AI, reasoning and learning. So that means also there could be different sources for bias to creep into the system. Either the bias in the logic or the bias is in a model, and these models are influenced by the data that we feed them, or potentially also when we apply this AI at runtime, there could also be data quality issues that lead to bias.
So is there a way that we can automate the process of identifying bias in AI? So can AI police itself effectively?
I mean, there are ways. So of course there are some systemic issues that need to be fixed, in the sense that people need to don't think data is objective, because data is subjective. So any AI that uses data, by definition, will be subjective. So it starts with that awareness, of systemic issues of discrimination or whatever that could exist, so that we are aware that it may happen. So the next step then is also to make sure that you have the proper controls in place, that for starters you can detect the bias, and that's in your models, but also in your automated decisions, right? So for example, what our customers do, they use a particular ethical bias check capability where we say, hey, let's when we're making automated decisions, and these are material decisions, maybe not just a certain marketing offer, but can we give you a loan or not, for example? It's a material decision. Can we simulate whether these decisions are biased or not? Let's grab a historical data set of customers and see what those decisions are, and let's look at certain protected variables like gender or income or whatever it is, and let's test whether the bias in these models and decisions is still within limits. So it starts with awareness. Then in terms of automation, you could have automated methods to actually detect whether there's bias in these models and decisions. That's not too hard. It's not rocket science. The next step is to indeed to correct it. So there's certain methods for self-correction. So algorithms that would re-rate your models or things like that. But I think it's also important to look at the root cause. So when you think of that example with the healthcare prevention model, the fundamental issue was lesson 1 in science and how do you set up your experiments, and that they used models that predict future healthcare costs. That was wrong, So if you have all kinds of self-correcting algorithms that trying to counter for that, you're solving the problem in the wrong place. You should have set up your data differently, and then you would not have had these bias issues. So I think it's certainly possible, but it needs to be countered with awareness of systemic issues, and people need to keep their thinking hat on if they apply these methods to see what was actually the root cause of my bias here. Is it logic? Is it models? Is it how I set up my data? As opposed to just, again, maybe have a techno-utopian approach to it, like, oh, well, we'll let the black box has some issues, we'll have another black box that automatically corrects for it, and we don't have to worry about it anymore, right? That could be more damaging.
So I guess this is similar to what we've been discussing, but what is ethical AI?
Ethical AI is not just about bias, but it introduces also other aspects around AI. For instance, transparency. You can imagine you may want to have a balance between how accurate particular AI is versus can we still understand the decisions that are made by AI. Maybe some super duper deep learning neural network, we may think that it gives more accurate predictions, but if we don't really understand how it gets to those predictions, maybe we should not be using it for particular use cases. And what's kind of aligned with that aspect of transparency is explainability or explainable AI. Can we ask the AI how it got to a particular prediction or decision for one particular case? Robustness is another one, right? So when people talk about developing AI systems, they sometimes think very much in terms of, I'm developing this AI and I need to check it's not biased, and then when I did all those checks, I can release it in the wild. I'm done. But of course, robustness is about how can how does the AI behave, to use a bit of a techie term, at runtime. Yeah, so how can it adapt and learn over time? And will an AI that we created a week ago, will it still give accurate predictions next week, next month, next year? And so there's a lot of development in terms of AI that would actually, where we break this whole dependency between, let's say, design time and runtime, but where AIs would be continuously adapting. Yeah, so which, it makes it more robust, but then again, you need to also continuously then check, whether you're not introducing kind of any ethical issues. But fundamentally, I think when a lot of people talk about AI ethics, they say, they frame it in terms of ethical constraints. This is what we're not allowed to do. And then other than that, game on. I think that's the wrong way to look at ethics. Ethics is not just about what you cannot do. Ethics should be how to lead a good life, or if you translate it to AI, it's what are the best ways to apply AI, right? So it also goes way beyond regulation, right? So it's really saying maybe the most fundamental lesson is making sure that you use it in the best interest to, let's say, for your customers or citizens, not just to the benefit of you as a government or you as a company. And there needs to be this kind of responsibility in applying AI, where you have this golden rule, this ethics of don't do to others what you want to be done to you, right? So I think that's the most fundamental, actually, AI ethical aspect, and you don't see a lot of discussion about it but for me, it's the most fundamental one.
Okay, so the next question, you've kind of already answered it, but it would be quite nice to do it again, because that way, then I can choose between which answers you give me, really. But it's three key considerations of ethical AI? And I quite like the idea of one of those considerations is explainable AI, and one of those considerations is the thing you just said about don't do unto others. So if you want, they can be two of the three key considerations. It's up to you, but I quite like those points. So, but anyway, three key considerations of ethical AI.
Great. So what are some of these typical aspects of ethical AI? We spoke about fairness and bias. That's one that pops up immediately in most of the discussions. So how can we minimize? We cannot completely remove bias. I think it's important for people to understand that that's not possible, because making it better for one group could affect other groups as well. But fairness and bias, that's an important one. The other one is more around transparency and explainability, indeed. So can we understand how did the AI come to its automated decisions? Can we understand the individual components? So what type of reasoning and rules, but also how did models get to their predictions? It's for me the most fundamental aspect is about. And I always stumble on the word itself. What is it? The ethics of reciprocity. There we go. So not bad maybe for a non-native speaker. But the golden rule of don't do to others what you don't want to be done to you. I think that's what I like about that one is that indeed, AI ethics get often misinterpreted as it's just about what you can't do, and then within those constraints, everything is fair game. Whereas this particular aspect really focuses on, not what you shouldn't do, but about what you should do, right? So, that's a very simple, fundamental way to think about making sure that we apply AI in a good way, in an ethical way.
So, how can we make business more productive? And for that matter, how can we make the economy more productive? Obviously, using AI.
So, like when I look more from the perspective, let's say the perspective of Pega, the company I work for, so we have roughly, let's say, 3 areas where we're using AI. One is more in one-to-one customer engagement, one-to-one marketing. So it's helping. The irony in here, the irony is then that we use technology to help companies to become more human. Yeah, because of course in the past, you had your little bank branch in a village, and the bank director knew everyone. So it wasn't hard to be empathic and to be relevant, and not just to be flogging products at customers. There would be a genuine interest in improving the financial well-being of all the people in the village, right? So, but in a modern situation, this example where you are a bank and you have 20 different channels to interact with your customers, and most of them are direct, like a mobile banking app, and then you could use AI to become more relevant, to understand customer needs, anticipate what they want, understand what's important to them in the moment, and really provide relevant next best actions, right? So that's one. We can use that intelligence and also in broader applications like customer service, for example. So how can we anticipate and can we predict customer problems and fix them before they happen? Yeah, or if customers would engage with you, because frankly, we all hate getting in touch with customers for customer service issues. So it's great if they could detect them before they happen and solve them. But if we get in touch with them, then we can also use that intelligence to try and understand what is the real problem that the customer has. What's the customer intent here? How do we? What is the most likely problem that the customer has, and what is the best resolution that would solve the customer issue? And so it would help us to become more proactive in our customer service, and to maybe also automatically or alongside an agent resolve those issues. And then fundamentally, the third area where we applied is intelligent automation. Yeah, so which is a rather grandiose term, because automation is something fairly generic. But I think we all recognize that there are benefits to automation. If you take a paper process or a process built across 20 different legacy systems, or people just emailing internally to get things done, that there's a benefit in automating that process more end to end. But there are also limits to those benefits, because in a way we're just copying the process that already exists into a new system. So yes, there are automation benefits, but where AI can help is to go beyond automation into optimization. So how can we truly maximize kind of business and customer outcomes when we're doing all these mundane tasks? So let's say if I have a claims system at an insurance company, how can we become more efficient? So which is, like maybe there's a surge of claims because of COVID coming in, but how can we still, with the same set of people, deal with all those claims that are coming in? But also, how can we become more efficient? So how can we use AI to steer towards making sure that, let's say it's a healthcare insurer, that all my members, that they get top quality care as quickly as possible. And on the flip side, that we detect the evil dentist that's trying to push through some fraudulent claims by saying, well, today I pulled 100 teeth for Michael, and just submitting all these tiny little claims, one per tooth, right? So AI can really help towards optimizing then for business and customer outcomes, to go beyond the benefits you would already have, let's say, through just automating the process.
Right. So this question's quite long, so I'm going to read it because I don't think I can memorize it. So history shows that technology can have negative effects in the short term, but positive benefits in the longer term. For example, during the 18th and 19th century, there is evidence from records from the British Army that the average height of new recruits actually fell during the first few decades of the 19th century, but then later started to increase again, which, and height being a proxy for, for diet when you were younger. So will it be similar with AI? Will there be a long-term benefit, but a short-term problem?
Yeah, so I think that's a great observation. So because the environment changes. So there's an effect of a technology on the environment. I must say that there's also another law which is called Amara's law, that people tend to overestimate the effect of a certain technology in the short term. And you see it in AI, people are already kind of are robots taking over the world next year, but they underestimate the effects in the long term. The effects in the long term is also because there's an interaction between technology and society, right? So like I'm a sucker for quotes, but there's another one is first we shape the tools and then the tools shape us. So first we invent AI, but then AI starts to invent us. We start to behave differently because of the AI. But I also said at the start, I'm a big believer in agency, right? So we cannot always predict these kind of side effects, but we need to be aware that they might happen. And then I'm a big believer that humans are actually quite adaptable and they can adapt to these circumstances. So there will be jobs. Yes, will there jobs that will disappear? Yeah, there will be jobs that disappear, but there will be new jobs that will come back for it, right? So I think ultimately, I think there's a big opportunity for AI to help with not just with the glamorous things like self-driving cars, but also with automating away a lot of the mundane work that's happening in businesses, right? So and optimizing those kind of rather mundane tasks to make sure that we as humans can focus on the things that we are best at, coming up with whatever creative questions and solutions, and leave some of the mundane stuff more to the AI that we're collaborating with.
Okay, interesting. Not necessarily for the interview, but just something I think is very interesting. Your point about overestimating in the short term and underestimating in the long term. Ray Kurzweil often says that it's human nature to think linearly, whereas technology often changes exponentially. But if that's true, that explains why we overestimate in the short term and underestimate in the long run, because that's exactly what happens if you think linearly and something changes exponentially, because with exponential things change very, very slowly and then get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I often sometimes think that's what happened with COVID. I think in the early days of COVID, people were thinking linearly, but in fact the virus was spreading exponentially, so we underestimated it.
Yeah, no, I fully
we learned
agree.
that lesson eventually, but it was a painful lesson,
Yeah, no, I fully agree, and I think so. It's both this idea of let's say overestimating the short term but underestimating the long term, and missing out on the fact that first we invent the tools, and then the technology, and then the technology actually changes us. That adaptability, that's something that, let's say, both the tech bros, the techno-utopians, as well as the Luddites, the dystopians, sometimes miss out on, right? Because techno-utopians go like, well, everything will be perfect. And they miss out on this idea that, like, we cannot foresee all the side effects, and actually that we are in a very dynamic system where the world will change because of it, right? So they're missing out there on that adaptability. But likewise, the Luddites, by saying, well, and then bad things will happen and there's nothing we can do about it, they're missing out on this key aspect that we as people, we were never able to predict the future really well. But what we were good at, typically, maybe it hurt and it took a while, but we're good in adapting. Yeah, so in that sense, we get like quasi-philosophical. I don't just believe in the singularity. Well, I believe in the singularity in the sense that there's a place in time where we cannot look beyond because we cannot imagine that future. But I think we're on a line of singularities. The singularity has happened many times before. Yeah, when we were hunter-gatherers, we could not imagine what the world would be like as farmers. When we were farmers, we could not imagine what the industrial society would look like. When automation started, we couldn't foresee a future where we would have tons of automation, tons of automation helping us with everyday processes. but also when you think from an AI perspective, it's hard for us to look beyond that particular point. Doesn't mean that you can't do anything about it, right? So I think that's a key point, that maybe both the extremes of the continuum, both the tech bros as well as the Luddites are kind of missing out on this kind of whole aspect of adaptability, and that the world is constantly changing, where we're constantly adapting to these new technologies.
How important is digital transformation to a company? And not just a company, for that matter, the economy, the country, maybe us as individuals, maybe we all need, maybe COVID was a digital transformation moment. Can you just talk about digital transformation for a moment? Company specific, but if possible, try and broaden it into a broad context as well. But I'm happy with it just being company related.
So, I mean, is digital transformation important for companies or maybe for societies and economies as a whole? Yes, of course. So not just companies, but also governments or public organizations and ultimately individuals. So I think you just need to look at how a 12-year-old is updating her Snapchat or whatever. You can see digital transformation at an individual level in full swing. Editing an entire kind of mini TV clip during dinner. I think that's a nice example of transformation at individual level. So digital transformation is very important to companies, of course, and I think also. It's not oversold as a concept, but when people say digital transformation, so to go back to how AI can help optimize mundane tasks, digital transformation is not just automating. It's not just taking your existing paper processes and then put them into a digital system. Because if your process, let's say, sucks, your digital process will suck as well. Excusez-le-mot. So transformation is really about doing things differently, in a more optimal manner. And I think in that sense, COVID has helped to accelerate that process as well, right? So in companies taking some bolder steps in terms of changing how they are engaging with customers, for example, right? So, or changing the way how they, intelligently automate work. Yeah, and if we want to keep up with the kids, we better do that, right? Because they have, these kind of more modern expectations they're the other side of the equation. They're the future consumers. These are the expectations that kids would have from the companies that they actually deal with. Ultimately, we're social animals. We humanize companies and we expect them to understand our needs and do what's relevant for us in the moment and make it quick and make it frictionless and make it seamless, right? So if we want to, if we want to satisfy the needs of those future consumers, we better kind of digitally transform. And because they will vote with their feet, they will work with a competitor, bank, telco, insurance company, whatever, as opposed to the companies that not have transformed. And that could also be kind of a wider type of thing. You were saying it, will it change society or economies? So this type of transformation could happen across an entire value chain of companies that are working together, or it can also help in opening up certain electronic markets, let's say for green energy or whatnot, making those more efficient, or at the societal level, it could help with providing more equal and access to education. So those are, this is how kind of micro level changes for one individual company can actually expand to value change or even expand to societies and economies as a whole.
Okay, that's great. So the last question, and I need you to get your crystal ball out for this one. which is 3 predictions, if possible. 1 prediction would do, but 3 would be nice, for the year 2030.
Oh, 2030, that feels like very far away. Yeah, so I think, well, let's maybe use, like I said at the beginning, you know, like I work in maximizing, you know, positive impact of responsible AI in business, in society, as well as in research, by being kind of 4 days a week working at a company, doing it for business, 1 day a week at university. I think in terms of AI in business, I already spoke about it a little bit, but I think we'll see a big move from not just the photogenic applications of AI, the self-driving cars and the prosthetic robot limbs, to actually solving very mundane, everyday processes and work. And that sounds maybe a little bit, let's say, almost to the point, it's mundane and boring. But I think really that people talk a lot about hyper automation. I really don't like that word, apart from the hyper, which sounds a bit more like a 90s corny electronic dance music song. It has the word automation in there, right? So how, and like I said, automation gives you some benefits, but it's not in maybe doing things in a better way, but not doing better things, right? So I think we really need to, what really will happen is that it will be used to go beyond automation into optimizing for business and customer outcomes, and using the smarts of AI to really drive towards, like, you know, what is the best process we should execute now? What kind of problem are we looking at actually, you know? What are the best ways to resolve this particular business problem in individual business processes? And so that's going in AI and business, it's going beyond hyper automation into business optimization. I think in terms of our relationship with AI and AI in society, there's a lot of developments now around ethical AI and responsible AI. So we're essentially, I think we're going to move, or have to move, from AI puberty to AI, well, let's say, let's be a little bit modest, to AI adolescence, right? So when AI was a kid, we were techno-utopians, everything was going to be beautiful. We're now entering this puberty where topics like AI ethics, responsible AI, they're kind of popping up. The industries were thinking they could do it through self-regulation, but governments everywhere are starting to introduce, let's say, proper regulation, which is a good thing. Take, the EU as well, for example, introducing their proposal for trustworthy AI a couple of weeks ago. And we'll see more and more of that. But then we also are going to look at, like, yeah, but how can we operationalize that? How can we make sure it's not just nice policy talk, but that we can really embed it in tools, methods, systems, people, that we can make trustworthy AI a reality, and that will allow us to kind of grow up, to exit puberty and enter adolescence. So that's more in the AI in society, and then maybe AI in research. I think once we solved artificial intelligence, then it's, you know, we're ready to move to artificial X. So I already jokingly said in the beginning that that's something that, more from a research perspective, something I'm interested in. I said jokingly because AI will never be solved, but it's of course, the reason why AI is so fascinating is because it tells us something about, not about the robots and the AI. It tells us about something about us as humans. What is intelligence? Where is it coming from? How can we learn? And it's also interesting then to not be restricted to just intelligence, but to move to these other topics of artificial creativity, or artificial emotions, or artificial whatever makes us human. And that has nice research implications. It tells us more about who we are as humans. We also better understand the limits of those metaphors, but ultimately it also has impact in, well, business applications. Looking at artificial eggs will also have business impact. When we talk about, let's say, artificial creativity, it's also how can the AI become a little bit more creative and work alongside humans to on all kinds of creative tasks that exist in business, like design, for example. Yeah, or when I talk about artificial emotions, it's especially when you're dealing with citizens and customers, and you need to really make sure that you do it in a responsible way. But it's crucial to understand, to not just have a high IQ, you also need to have a high EQ, emotional quotient, and really understand what is the emotion of the customer that you are dealing with, and use that in a responsible way, of course. Or ultimately artificial morality, when one of the key cornerstones of AI ethics for me is not about transparency and bias and all of those things, which are very important, but can all be summarized to the golden rule of don't do to others what you don't want to be done to you, right? So how can we build that those ethical principles into logic and AI that companies use to interact with customers, for example, to make sure that you're not just maximizing your own profit, but you're maximizing, you're optimizing the value the customer is getting out of the relationship, as opposed to just the other way around. Yeah, so in that sense, going beyond artificial intelligence and looking at these artificial other things that make us human, they can have very practical business impact as well.
Great. I'm thinking that when you were talking about mundane examples of artificial, I don't know whether this is artificial intelligence or whether it's something more basic than that. Maybe it's RPA, I don't know. But I'm thinking the other day I was sending someone an email. I said, if there's a problem, call. And it through my telephone number appeared. And I thought, that's clever. It knew I was about to type my telephone number in. Or if you're registering for something and it sends you a text message with the key, it appears on the screen. I think that's really clever, and that's something I've only become aware of in recent months, doing things like that. Or the other one, which I remember was very shocked the first time I discovered it, was when someone was ringing me and they weren't in my address book, but my phone had worked out I had an email from this person. And they said, maybe it could be so-and-so, maybe it's so-and-so.
Yeah.
It's all very clever stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's all, of course, it all requires proper consent and opt-in, etc. But ultimately, I think I said mundane rather jokingly, because I think it's less photogenic, but it's really important to help customers, but also employees or your B2B, business to business counterparts, to get stuff done. Just help people to get stuff done, and not just by automating it, but being smart about trying to understand what is the outcome that the customer wants here, or that the business needs, or that the employee needs to reach, and how can we use the intelligence to get you to that outcome quicker, faster, or maybe also to better outcomes. I think that's the big opportunity, actually. And you can see AI now trickling down into these kind of into these core business processes that we are executing anywhere in a business, and not just automating the steps, but maximizing the outcomes, to make it easier for the customer, better for the employees, deliver the outcomes for the business. I think that's where what we will see is that AI will get into the veins, in that sense, not just the arteries, but into the veins of these organizations, right? And really help, optimize all your business processes.